Good evening, everyone. My name is Beth Sheffield. I am the Adult Programming Coordinator here at Central Library. Thank you all for coming out for this wonderful event. Many of you have participated in One City, One Book before. Here in Greensboro, every other year we ask the community to all read one book. And we did it around community and food. And this kind of feels like a continuation of it. We will be having our next One City, One Book in 2025. We are beginning to take selections for that. If anyone has selections, they can just email us here at the library for this program. Nancie participated in the book was Carolina Table, North Carolina Writers on Food, and Nancie has contributed to that. And so that's how I met Nancie McDermott, who will be in conversation with Anne Byrn tonight. Nancie is a James Beard nominated cookbook author. She has multiple cookbooks and is a food educator and has a wonderful blog about food and does webcasting most every week on food and food culture. And she's from right here in North Carolina, so we're very honored to have her as our moderator tonight. Now it's my pleasure to introduce one of our local bakers from Savor the Moment, owner of Savor the Moment, Tanya McGaskill Dickens. Tanya is here, and she's going to introduce Anne Byrn. Oh, and she brought some coupons for Savor the Moment that I will leave on the book table.
Good evening, everyone. So excited to introduce Anne. I mean, I'm just finding out about her. I'm already fascinated. I listened to some interviews she's done online, and I love the cookbook. It's beautiful if you don't have it already. I like the diversity in recipes from different cultures throughout the South. Just a little bit about Ms. Anne Byrn. She is a New York Times best-selling food writer and cookbook author based in Nashville, Tennessee, where she learned to cook and bake as a child alongside her mother, as many of us did, right? Mm-hmm. Every holiday she shared with her extended family. She had a very large family of cousins. I think it was like 15 years that she was also an editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and attended school in France, in Paris, France, receiving an advanced certificate there. But while she was raising her 3 kids, it was kind of challenging. Her husband, I think her husband was helping her out when she would do sporadic book tours. Now he's retired and they can move about a little bit more freely and give us an opportunity to meet her in person, which is amazing. But she, after raising her kids, she embraced some shortcuts and wrote the bestseller, The Cake Mix Doctor, one of the Southern Enlivens magazine's top 100 cookbooks of all times. That's amazing. She is also the author of American Cake and Skillet Love. When she isn't baking or gardening, which I think are 2 great skills to have, she writes a weekly newsletter Between the Layers on Substack. So here we are. Anne, thank you so much for being here with us in Greensboro.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Get cozy. Hey, Anne.
Hey, Nancie.
I've had the pleasure of meeting Anne before, and I've been a fan of her books for a long time, so this is really a treat.
Did it, yeah.
So I wanted to start by talking about this book. So 200 recipes, 14 states, 150 photographs, and you heard The Cake Mix Doctor, American Cookie, American Cake. You've written a lot of books, you've been a newspaper food editor. What was different about writing this cookbook after all the cookbooks you've done, and what was familiar?
Right. Can y'all hear me at the back?
Yes.
Okay, good. What was different? This book was expansive. I have read, when I wrote the book American Cake, pick the 100 cakes in America that are the most popular, dig into the stories, super test the recipes, and make them work for any kitchen. This was expansive. This was stories and recipes about baking from Texas all the way through the South on up to Maryland. And these were places where I hadn't lived. I didn't call home. So I had to approach this project as a journalist and research it and write it and interview countless people to get a feel for all of those states. It was a big difference. I also felt, how should we say, nervous about writing about a book about areas in which I did not grow, where I did not grow up. You know, it's like me coming here to North Carolina and talking to you all about baking. I hope to get, some feedback from you on what you think is the baking of North Carolina. I could only base this book on interviews with people like Nancie, etc., old cookbooks and research. What was the same was that I've always loved making the most challenging recipes doable. I think that stems from writing that book, The Cake Mix Doctor. I really want people to bake. And when I finished the book, I could have had this list of resources at the back on where you can order all of these heirloom flours, etc. And I didn't want to do that because I think in the feel of the South, the South has always baked with what they had. And for me to tell you to go to Amazon and order some fancy flour just didn't seem Southern to me. And so that part of it was the same. Yeah.
That is wonderful. Okay, historical recipes. This book is, somebody writing about it, or maybe who interviewed you said, it's a history book that includes the food of the South. And not a history book. If you think history is dull and boring, then we don't mean that. But really the stories and looking back, and there's recipes from 2 years ago, and there's recipes from 17 something or other. How is it different to research? And I know you've always researched and been a journalist certainly with the book about the 100 Cakes of America. That's a lot of research. But how was researching recipes that are from the 17 or the 1800s? How does the history part of it? What's that like? Because you come up with something that we can make at home.
Right. Well, as far as the story behind the recipe, it took a lot of reading. And I read about the South, not just old cookbooks, but I read books about the South. And my favorite books, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkinson, and The Gulf by Jack Davis. Those were two of my favorites. And I really wanted to tap into Southern culture and try to understand the South and historical events that have, not just the Civil War, but others that have taken place in the South and how they affect the Southerners. I also wanted to learn about Southern agriculture because the takeaways of this book is that Southern baking was based on the land and the people who were here. And the people migrated in either by their own free will or were forcibly brought here to work, the enslaved. And so that to me was the backbone of Southern baking, really. And then the land provided the ingredients. So as far as old recipes go, I think you just have to do some detective work. You have to first sort of decipher them because a lot of the words are not the same words we use now. There are a lot of tools online to help do that today. We work with old recipes like what is the butter the size of a walnut and butter the size of a hen's egg. I love all those. And so I actually have that in the front of the book is how to take those measurements from old recipe cards and make them work. So, and then I think too, we were talking in the beginning about how a lot of the old recipes are written in cursive and how, was it Tanya? We were talking about how cursive is not taught in the schools anymore. And so what's going to happen in about 20 years from now when the recipes that my mother wrote, her mother wrote down on little index cards in cursive? Is this going to be some new language we have to decipher? Everything changes. I love cursive. I think it's beautiful to look at. And I could tell by looking at the recipe cards in my family box whose it was based on her handwriting. Yeah.
I'm sure many of you could pick something up off a table. And this was this person's.
You know who wrote it.
You see an envelope in your mailbox that has writing on it, not by a computer.
Very much so. And recipes really are about people. And that's why a project like this meant so much to me, because I was researching the stories of these people across the South, and this was a recipe that they were known for, and this was their life. And so I took it seriously, and I think recipes oftentimes the cooks in the South who wrote the or didn't write the recipes, who cooked the food, never got credited and were unseen. And that was a big part of writing this book, was changing that.
I'm kind of a place and story nerd, so the next thing I wanted to ask about was, as Tanya said, you went to La Byrn in France, got the advanced certificate, and you spent a year in England. So those are two very different foodscapes from North Carolina, from Georgia, from the USA. What did you see there that really struck you about their food years later now? And what did you bring home as far as things that affected you?
That's great questions. Overall, what I saw there is that the French and the British don't bake at home as much as we do in the South. They have, especially in Paris and France, they have bakeries, the boulangerie, the patisserie, that are fantastic. Why would you want to bake, right? But they have beautiful flour. Their flour is very soft, wheat, which means it's low in protein. It makes all of those pastries. It's very similar to Southern flour. Britain, England, on the other hand, not so great flour. I discovered very hard, gritty, very high protein, really hard to make biscuits, biscuits for breakfast or even brownies. That was tough, but they don't bake, they don't have that heritage of baking at home. And that was really based on this research. The South has been a very poor and isolated region through history. And we did not have the commercial bakeries that you would find up north. And so what did people have to do? You had to bake at home. And why did you bake at home? To feed people. Baking was not just for these beautiful pastries and cakes
Great point.
to put out. It was cornbread and biscuits, and it filled you up. It was the bread on the plate, and it filled up. And if anybody has ever fed a teenage son, you know how hungry they are, or you've been a teenage son, you know how hungry you are, and that's where bread comes right into play in baking. Yeah.
I think it was Bill Neal when I was first starting writing and thinking about food. We say seriously, but I don't mean like seriously, but curiously and really wanting to know things. Pointed out what you said, that hot bread is part of living in the South. It's, maybe not now, but say in 17 and 18 and the 1900s. And my mother grew up on a dairy farm outside of between Chapel Hill and Hillsborough. And 3 meals a day, there would be hot bread. And he said that was crucial to the presence of baking in the South. I thought, I knew that, I didn't know that, I'd never thought of it, but it rings completely true. And biscuits in the morning, a cold biscuit to take with you to school or wherever, hot cornbread, and then hot rolls for a special occasion. That was crucial. And when people say, oh, I can't make good biscuits. Well, my grandmother made wonderful biscuits. But by the time I was eating her biscuits, she'd been making them for decades. Yeah. So part of making good biscuits is to make biscuits. There is not a recipe that even Ann Byrn can write that will let you go home and make your grandmother's biscuit. It asks something of us.
Right.
So,
and you've said that about pie too, because when I interviewed Nancie for the pie chapter, I think that was, to paraphrase, it was to be good at pie, you have to make pie. You just go and make pie, right? Or something like that.
In your first crust, your 13th crust and your 25th crust, you're going to get better, not because of a better recipe, but you're going to feel things in your hand. And I mean, how many things are like this? Riding a bike, driving a car, you don't think about it. You can listen to the radio and be making a grocery list while you're doing all these complicated things. But yeah, and we kind of don't like to hear that. We kind of want to do it perfectly for the party I'm having Saturday. But I'm gluten-free, or I can't use butter or something, and it's like, it's a big ask.
Yeah, and when I started this book, I really did not consider myself proficient at biscuits at all. I probably consider myself really good at making cakes, and I understand cakes. But biscuits, I just hadn't had a lot of practice. So going through these recipes, testing all these recipes, just figuring out the difference in the recipes, I not only came away with the type of biscuit that I personally like, because I've got 22 biscuit recipes.
Think about that.
There's something for everyone. And also, they have different textures. And some are very crunchy and bake at 500 degrees, like a Scott Peacock biscuit. But, and others, like Natalie's biscuit with self-rising flour and cream. Only 2 ingredients. It makes a pillowy biscuit, just lovely. Yes, so easy, but it's just delicious. A slice of ham or fried chicken or whatever in that biscuit, it's the perfect vehicle. So I think, to me, biscuits are personal. Scott Peacock says that biscuits can smell fear. You just gotta get in there and do it. You just gotta get in there and do it. And get your hand, yeah, she's writing that down. You'll get a subject out of that. And then I think too, getting your hands in something like biscuits. I grew up, my mother taught me to cut fat into flour with 2 knives, sort of like this little dance with the knives. But it's a ridiculous way to get fat into flour. It does not serve the purpose. The best way is to get your hands in there and smush the fat with your fingertips into the flour. And then you've got these little flat pieces, and some of them small and some of them big. And then you add your buttermilk. And then mix it lightly, dump it out onto the board, lightly floured. And if you want some layers, start folding it over and give it a quarter turn, fold, quarter turn. But don't touch your biscuit dough. Pastry hands, really light touch. Then get your cutter, cut straight down. Put them in an cast iron skillet and bake them at 500 degrees. And you'll have perfect biscuits.
And then when you turn them out, it's a raggedy mess.
It's a ragged, yeah.
You know, and that I've read somewhere, somebody saying it will be
Shaggy
raggedy.
dough.
Shaggy,
Dough.
that's it, yes.
It's just shaggy dough.
And then it's like, oh, okay, it's not wrong. It's not going to look like we've got beautiful biscuits.
Right.
It won't look like, well, not on the cover,
Not on that
but there are stages, there are steps. And if you know where you're going, when you're driving on a country road where you've been
Right.
before, you're not worried about it. It's like, wait, it said there was a gas station, or is that a plum tree? I don't know. So
Yeah. Yes, very true.
biscuits can smell fear. That's so good. Okay, listen, we talked about and France and England. Any particular dishes that you make that you?
Oh, that I
those
love,
more
that I
general?
learned there, yeah.
What
I
do
think,
you love to have?
right, well, I think definitely what I learned in France was just the French appreciation for food as it comes. And I think in the South, I grew up with through the meat and what we call in Middle Tennessee, the meat and 3. The meat and then 3 vegetables with it and then the hot bread. In France, each one of those would be served as a separate course. I mean, you would get the peas of the season, or then you get and they're the field peas, and then they might bring you something. So we, in the South, compared to the South, the French definitely present food in stages, and it always seems much more elegant than the way we eat in the South, which is just out of hunger, I suppose, chow down. And then I think in England, I just learned that they're fascinated with American baking. I mean, even in the grocery stores, don't you think, John? Or they were, they called them American pancakes, American brownies, yeah. Everything was American. And these new friends of that, they wanted me to make those foods, chocolate chip cookies, brownies, and pancakes. They may think that we're too loud and too brash, but they love our food. They secretly love what we eat. That's England, yeah.
And we are too loud, too brash.
We are.
Okay, on your Instagram, I was looking through, and there's a picture, a black and white picture, I'd say maybe in the 1950s or early 60s.
Yeah, before children.
But
That would be pre-1954, that photo of my mother, yeah.
I hear you. And you talk about your mother, she would have been 98 recently. And you said she's the best cook you ever met.
Right.
And could you just talk a little bit about her growing up in her kitchen and her and food?
So, yeah. So my mother, Bibi, and this is her photo in a swimsuit, which was definitely 1 year into marriage and no children yet, for sure. She was the youngest of 5 daughters in Nashville. She was born in 1925, so she would be 100 next year. She grew up, and when she was 4 years old when there was the Great Depression. And so really she spent her young life through the 1930s. She lost her father early. So the very close relationship with her 4 older sisters. They were all so close all their lives. They shared a room, they shared a dresser, they shared clothes. 4 older sisters,
Wow.
yeah. And so she was very social. And she wasn't happy unless there were 30 people in the house eating dinner. And so she always made a lot of food. She just made a lot of food. And I have great memories of being, coming home from college and coming back, and you go in the basement door and you go right to the utility room where the washer dryer was, and there was a big old chest freezer. And you go back and raise the chest freezer to see what she'd been cooking. Because she always made too much, and there would be creme de menthe parfaits and leftover beef stroganoff and yeast rolls. She was just she loved to entertain, she loved really beautiful food, and she was a lot of fun. So I grew up with that. She let my sisters and I cook and bake anytime we wanted to. We just had to clean up the kitchen. So she was definitely not one of those moms who, turned out the lights of the kitchen at a certain hour and said, nobody's, go to bed. Because we would start often cooking at 10 o'clock at night. But she was a good, she was super, well, I used to. Now I sleep. Yeah. So that was my mom. So I grew up with the idea that you could be wildly creative and you could cook and make it to clean up after yourself. But other than that,
That's a good way, and not I'm really good at it and not strict about it.
Right, but I think too, a couple things. Because she was raised in the Depression, she loved sugar cookies. She put sugar on sliced tomatoes in the summertime, which I've never seen anybody. Has anybody heard that before? Yeah. She could never explain it. You have?
Yeah.
Yes. She could never explain it, but I think once I researched American cake and I realized what people did after World War II, once the rationing was over and sugar was available again, how things like sugar cookies were just really dear because you could taste the white sugar.
Okay. Switching to pie. This is not to talk about pie. This is, again, from Instagram. So, look at this pie. It's in the book. It's
Kentucky brown sugar pie with
the
a meringue.
It's elegant and gorgeous, and somebody made that in preparation.
I made that.
Oh my gosh!
I was in Arkansas, Little Rock. I was at the book festival in Little Rock about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that was a kitchen in a library there. And actually, it was a really interesting location in Little Rock because outside the door, a window, is Dunbar High School. And I don't know how much of y'all know Little Rock history from like 1955 was the Little Rock Nine, which was when the 9 teenagers tried to go to Little Rock High School. And Dunbar was the African American school at the time. And these students were there, but they wanted to go to Little Rock High School because they had more offerings and they could study biology, etc. So it was in a very historic area of Little Rock. It was fascinating, and I was making that pie looking out the window at that whole high school. Yeah, so, and that was just using somebody else's, using the library oven. I think meringue is beautiful no matter. You don't have to do much.
Really. How can I stop my meringue from weeping? I think it's a plus, little gold gold sweets. It's like a kiss from an angel. It's like, you made meringue, don't worry.
Yeah, and there was no weeping on that one. I really think that that's for a pie hanging around too long, and you just you need to invite a few more people over to eat it, don't you? Yeah.
Well, actually, I say this one not for the pie, which I definitely want to make, but the post that Anne wrote about that is, I was scheduled to speak at the Six Bridges Book Festival and made the brown sugar pie, and with some free time I was curious to learn about the Little Rock Nine after sharing a buttermilk pound cake recipe from Chef Eliza Ashley in my book. Ashley was the Arkansas Governor's Mansion, was in the Arkansas Governor's Mansion kitchen the morning 67 years ago, last week, this is from a while back, when 9 black students were enrolled in Little Rock Central High School as part of a nationwide desegregation following Brown v. Board of Education. And it's her commentary on it, just after she finished the thing, she knew that that was important and wanted to learn more. And you just find so much depth and resonance of life in the South in terms of recipes and stories. And I
Well,
thought
the
that was
South,
so wonderful.
thank you. You know, the South, this project is, wow, it's opened my eyes. And I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about these events in Southern history, but I have now. And I think that it has been most gratifying to explore them and to wonder what it was about human nature in the South that allowed people to be so cruel. And I don't know if it was as much human nature as it was just the government or politicians telling us that the way we ought to think, what we should do.
We've been taught.
We've been
It's
taught.
not people just woke up and thought, oh, I'm mad about this. It's been very...
Right, but since then, I think if you read the story about Little Rock Nine, you'll see there was a lot of reconciliation. That famous, I think it was a Life magazine photo of this young black woman with beautiful starched dress.
White shirtwaist dress. She's seen this picture.
You know this photo, and she's looking down, and behind her is a white girl sort of heckling her. Well, those two women reconciled, and it's a beautiful story. And so if you're ever in Little Rock, I highly recommend going to that site and taking that tour. That's the South. But the South is also full of reconciliation. It's also full of people who've come together. And I think look at what's happened in the western part of your state and the eastern part of my state with Hurricane Helene, and how people have just, these efforts they've made to feed the community and people coming together.
Immediately.
Where was I? I was in Winston-Salem 2 days ago, and a couple of women drove in from the Asheville area for the signing, and you know they just needed to get away. And they said, you know, as bad as it was, and one of them lost her house, as bad as it was, how they're being embraced by their community and the entire country is just phenomenal and wrapping around. And being back to, you know, the South has had a history of just tragic storms and tragic weather. Look at Katrina and how it relocated people outside of New Orleans. We have a really long coastline. We are very vulnerable. We have the mountains, the bayous, farmland, and the coast. We have a unique area.
That's right. This is Florida.
All the way
So
up.
much.
Yeah, and we are the size of Western Europe. So based on all that, and based on all of the people,
Wow.
yeah, it's huge, yes, that have come to the South, I do believe that's why the South is the most unique region of the country and why people are fascinated by us. And our baking is the best.
I'm not arguing.
That's right.
Well, speaking of specific places, well, I wanted to talk about Marcy Cohen Ferris's
Oh, yeah.
jam cake.
Jam cake, yeah, it's a good one.
You talked about Marcy Cohen Ferris is a professor of American history at UNC Chapel Hill, and a scholar and just a brilliant person focused on food along with all the other scholarly details. Has written extensively about it in a number of books. I'm sure Scuppernong Books has some Marcy Cohen Ferris books. But one of the books featured in her book, Matzo Ball Gumbo, Culinary Tales of the Jewish South, which came out maybe 2012, 2013,
That's
something like
right,
that.
yeah.
And tell her story. I'm gonna find that picture.
Well, Marcy grew up in northeastern Arkansas from the Delta, and her relatives were Jewish. One side was Russian Jews, and the other, I believe, German Jews, Ashkenazi. And so that was the culture, but she grew up Jewish in the South in a very isolated place. And as a result, she really experienced not only preservation of old recipes, but also assimilation, because her next door neighbors were Baptist, and her mother liked to bake their recipes for pound cake, but she would hang on to these recipes like the jam cake for Rosh Hashanah and for Jewish holidays. And that was something that Marcy shared with me years ago, but it's very true. And I found in my research that it happened all over the South. It happened in Savannah, in Montgomery, wherever there was a Jewish community, there was a community. But there wasn't always a synagogue, and they would travel. And there weren't always enough people to celebrate with for a holiday. And some families just weren't bakers. So there were bakeries in the South, like Gottlieb's in Savannah, that would make challah and babka, and they would ship the breads and the cakes on Greyhound to different parts of the South. So I think that growing up Jewish in the South for Marcy really informed her about, and I love that book, and her recipe is a jam cake, which in my research in American cake is a German cake, German or German Jewish cake, because it's a spice cake. It's based on blackberry jam, and blackberries grew wild throughout the South. And it was a cake that was made, but when it came down south, which I find interesting, it got the caramel frosting.
And it's probably not Ashkenazi.
Exactly.
There would be a pound.
Right, and I think it's one of the most unique Southern cakes because of the old world heritage of that cake, but how it came south, and the Delta came up, and all of a sudden it had a caramelizing by the time it hit Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Alabama. And that is, the Jewish cake is a Christmas cake in Nashville. So yeah, that is the South, yeah.
Can't you just hear somebody saying this? You know what would be real good if you could caramelize? Good.
That's right, yeah.
It's like, yeah, let's try it.
Yes.
I love it. And food and religion, I mean, that's what a way to think about history and stories and connections and adjustment. And when do you compromise and change? And when do you drive all the way to wherever it was to get the loaf of challah or something?
Right.
Couldn't do it every week, but how did people keep that alive? Her books are really, really wonderful.
Really.
Okay, recipes. So another picture is in Birmingham, and this is Anne with Dr. Jessica B. Harris, who was here in Greensboro, February, March?
March.
Yeah, in March of this year.
Oh, nice.
And was interviewed by a history professor from here. It's absolutely wonderful. And this is Carla P. Hall. You know Carla Hall. And so Anne walks into this wonderful restaurant,
Chez Von Fun in Birmingham, Frank
And-
Stitt's restaurant.
and here are two international food celebrities
Icons.
here, along three icons together.
Right.
And
It
this
was
made-
definitely fangirl time. I think I was across the restaurant in about 2 seconds. I thought, that is Jessica B. Harris. Yes, it was wonderful. And I had interviewed Dr. Harris for this book. And she granted me an interview, which I was very happy about because she explained rice culture to me and the connection between the low country rice cultivation and Western Africa and the rice coast of Africa. So it was great to meet her.
Awesome. And many of you, I'm sure, have seen High on the Hog, the Netflix series. I think there's been two seasons of that done. And she was a key resource for that.
Yes, very much.
And if you haven't seen it, watch it, High on the Hog. Okay, so Jessica Harris, Carla Hall, you've got Zora Neale Hurston's Molasses Cornbread, you've got Natalie Dupree's Cream Biscuits, Eudora Welty, that were in the library, Southern Literature, Eudora Welty's neighbor's fruitcake recipe. Eudora Welty called it Mrs. Mosel's.
Mrs. Mosul. But it would be good as Mrs. Mosul. But it was Mrs. Mosul. It was
Mrs. Mosel's
I wonder if Mrs.
fruitcake.
Mosul was Jewish, yeah. I'll have to look into that.
We'll
Yeah.
be back to you.
Jackson, Mississippi.
And we'll find
I
out.
will find out.
So Eudora Welty contributes a recipe to the symphony, the Jackson, Mississippi Symphony Guild fundraising.
She actually wrote the
cookbook.
foreword for the Jackson cookbook that was published for the Jackson Symphony Guild, yeah. If you ever see a copy of that hanging around in a used book sale or in an estate sale, snatch it up, because it is a 4-page foreword by Eudora Welty talking about growing up in Jackson, Mississippi in her mother's kitchen, making homemade mayonnaise, and picking up the telephone for the lady who called to sell vanilla. So it was just, yeah, it's all in the foreword to that cookbook, yeah.
I haven't written it. I'm going to find that. Okay, names. Minnie Pearl's Corn Light Bread, and Mama Dip. Many of you have been to Greensboro to Mama Dip's kitchen. Mama Dip's sweet potato biscuits. So this got me thinking about all the names in the book, and many of them are famous names that I've mentioned, and then there are a lot of names of people that I've never heard of. It's full of names. And Eudora Welty used a name for, what's the deal? And you mentioned it actually earlier. What is it about names and recipes
That's a
in
good
Southern?
point. Yeah. Well, Eudora Welty believed that to recall someone's name, a friend's name that's attached to a recipe, is to remember that friend once again, to paraphrase her. So Mrs. Mosel's fruitcake, if she pulls out that recipe and it's called Mrs. Mosel's fruitcake, she remembers Mrs. Mosel. She probably remembers her mother. She probably remembers the street they were on and when she made the fruitcake. Maybe she remembers tasting the fruitcake. It is that friend, and I think it also brings us back to that point in our life, you know. And I have, but I'll jump in and say that there's a recipe in the book called Mrs. Collins' sweet potato cake. Actually, that was a cake I was on Raleigh TV a couple mornings ago and had that recipe on air. And Mrs. Collins is a woman from Nashville, and she lived in the house that we live in now. And her granddaughter was at my signing last night in Durham. I mean, it's a small world, right? But so I very much agree with Eudora Welty that naming a recipe after someone does help you remember it. So I would urge you, if you've got family recipes and you're thinking about cataloging them and documenting them, to go ahead and give them a name for who made the recipe. You'll thank yourself later and keep
Beth, how are we doing on time?
Okay, everyone okay? We'll take maybe a couple more and then take questions from the audience. Is that everyone?
I noticed Bill Neal's persimmon pudding, and it's persimmon season. How many of you love persimmon pudding?
Yeah.
Oh, right. It's, North Carolina it's a thing that I forgot
It
about.
must be a thing, because nobody else in the South is into persimmon pudding but you all.
Keep it going.
I think it's great. I think it's great, yeah.
I mean, before I knew the word foraging,
Yeah.
North Carolinians and Tennessee and all the way over to Indiana.
Yeah,
Okay, it's not just the South, but it is in cooler parts of the South, the wild persimmons that are about the size of a ping pong ball, and persimmon pudding. And that's something that I completely forgot about, and then moved back to Greensboro, taught middle school in High Point, drove back and forth every day, grew up in High Point. And I went to the farmer's market that's in a softball stadium. Is there still an old, there's an old farmer's market in an old stadium. Oh, not stadium, but it was. And I was just there getting all my things, and I saw this squares of, wrapped up in plastic wrap. And I thought, what is that? I want it. Why do I want it? I mean, it's persimmon pudding. So.
Wow, and they sell it there. Wonderful.
Well, this was a long time ago. They may not. That brought me back to it, and looking up, what's a recipe. Well, old people know, but it certainly wasn't.
Well, there was a lot of foraging, and black walnuts for
Oh
sure.
my gosh!
And I grew up with black walnuts in our yard, and my dad, he drove the car all the back over.
There's so much trouble.
Yeah, they are too much trouble. But you know, in some parts of the deep south, pecans were foraged because pecans were in your yard, pawpaws in September, certain parts of the south.
And Byrn says that you can use pawpaws if you can find them in banana bread.
It's true.
It's a one-to-one.
It is a one-to-one, but they gotta be ripe, or you get a stomachache.
What are pawpaws?
Wow, they call, there's another name for them called the something banana, aren't they? They almost look like a mango.
They look a lot like a mango, only a little bit.
But they're a sweet, wild fruit that grows, sort of hangs down from the tree, very hidden. And the leaves of the tree almost remind me of a big persimmon type of leaf. It's almost like a big fronds.
Super size.
And you find them. And then if you do find them, you've got several trees. And there's a grove of them. But they are a soft fruit, a lot like banana, in cooking. With a very distinct, almost more of a tropical, juicy fruit kind of taste. You know, juicy fruit gum, do you remember the taste of that? To me, that's what a pawpaw tastes like, kind of, sort of. Yeah, different, yeah.
Okay, now, one more comment. You wrote, I think your newsletter is, you talked about coffee cake. You first an experience with it in Britain. Just never thought about coffee cake. And then you talked about how it's a thing to make now.
Right.
I thought that's a good way to.
Okay, yeah. So I wrote today in my newsletter about coffee cake. I love coffee cake. I think it's a recipe that definitely I saw in a lot of community cookbooks, church cookbooks. This particular recipe I shared today came from a church cookbook in Middle Tennessee. Coffee cakes are really old. The whole idea of making coffee cakes is more Scandinavian, perhaps, German. You see a lot of coffee cakes. When I was researching American cake, I saw them in a lot of the old settlement cookbooks that were published in Portland, Milwaukee. They were Jewish cookbooks. But the use of cinnamon and spice in coffee cakes and sitting down and having a square coffee cake with coffee, with your neighbors, with community. It's something we don't do anymore. And we don't take the time. We buy the coffee cake from Starbucks. Starbucks has made money on coffee cakes. But I have a really great, what I grew up with in coffee cake was a sour cream and cinnamon coffee cake recipe that's in this book, and it's excellent. Yeah.
And she talks about it sort of as comfort food. You know, that
Yeah.
right now there's a lot going on, and I think we kind of feel overwhelmed a lot. And I've always turned to baking as sort of a way to get through, a distraction, a pleasure. I bake when I'm sad, I bake when I'm happy. I think it's kind of a place to go because you get out of yourself, you're doing something, you gotta pay a little bit of attention, but not too much. And then you've got something that you are sort of tempted to share with people.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
And then, you know, when you're helping other people and you're providing food and sharing food with other people, it does help you feel better about life, for sure. I have a daughter who lives in Jacksonville, and she started doing some private chefing and catering. And I asked her, why? Do you enjoy it? It's a lot of work. And she said, well, when people tell me listen, people tell me how wonderful I am. That's what she said. I said, why do you like it? People tell me how wonderful I am. And I thought, oh, I told you you're wonderful. It's not the same thing. When she makes something and people love her food, and I guess it's true for you, Tanya, in your bakery. Is that true?
I was just thinking we were saying that's so me.
That's so you. It's so you too. All right. So this was your therapy session.